Malakoda Red presents The Desolate Highway by Ken Snyder. The red-tailed hawk soared over the desert, riding a vortex of rising air up to his hunting altitude. The landscape passed beneath his outstretched wings as he scanned the ground for signs of movement. A couple of beats of his wings carried him out of the rising air as he turned south, gliding over the long black streak of earth that he'd never seen the end of. What a strange patch of land it was. Not water, not earth, not rock, but a peculiar substance that radiated heat like a fire. It was the perfect hunting ground. It was like a beacon that called in every cold-blooded animal from the surrounding desert, a smorgasbord of the finest order. The red-tailed hawk locked onto movement at the edge of the black band of ground. He folded his wings and plummeted from the sky. The diamond patterns on the coiled snake would normally provide the perfect protection in the sagebrush and sand, but sitting against the contrasting black color of the strange strip of land, it was almost too easy. Had no idea its end was near. The red-tailed hawk flashed his razor-sharp talons, separating the head from the body in one fell swoop. The body coiled and writhed as he landed next to his headless meal. He surveyed his surroundings for signs of danger and found he was alone. His talons clicked on the abstract surface, closer to rock than dirt. He didn't care for walking on the tacky ground or the monsters that traveled upon it, but he couldn't deny life had never been better since he came upon this unnatural tract of land. The first few bites were delectable as he tore at the flesh, gobbling it greedily down. Easy prey preyed upon easily. Life out here in the wastelands was pretty sweet. The red-tailed hawk was grateful for the black patch of land and its shiny roaring beasts that traveled down its path. A growl from the east drew his attention from his meal. The red-tailed hawk let out a shrill cry as one of the red beasts screamed past him with its strange scent. He ruffled his feathers and screeched at the passing monster for interrupting him. The show of aggression had kept the beast from setting upon him so far. Maybe they had no interest in eating him, but he kept a wary eye on them nonetheless. The red-tailed hawk decided that he'd had enough excitement for the day. He never knew if the beast may turn and decide to investigate what he was doing or try to take his delicious meal. He fluttered his wings and rose into the air to finish his meal somewhere a little more private. A place he could let his wings down and focus on eating the succulent, coppery-flavored flesh. Mark Guthrie's new 69 Peterbilt 359 charged through the superheated desert air. The empty two-lane road stretched beyond the horizon as far as he could see. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and he was starting to regret the decision to try the new shortcut he'd found earlier in the day. The route looked too good to be true as he sat in a booth at the Flying Something or Another, one of the thousands of cookie-cutter truck stops that dotted the American highways. Mark had made the run from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles countless times, yet he'd never noticed the small black line between Henderson and Barstow. It looked like it could shave a couple hours off his trip. With the price of diesel rising to 40 cents a gallon, he figured what the hell, and decided to give it a shot. The road shimmered in front of him as the unrelenting sun baked the desert into oblivion, and his air conditioner was working about as well as a blowtorch on the sun. Sweat poured from his body, darkening his white t-shirt and sticking it to his body. The fountain coke he'd bought at the truck stop was hot and sickly sweet on his tongue, but he chugged the rest anyway, tossing the empty cup onto the floor of the passenger side of the truck. 5 hours on the road now, and he'd only seen 3 cars and an old 55 Ford pickup with a black and white border collie in the bed. Never again, he thought to himself. Next time I'm sticking to the interstate. Mark turned on the radio and spun the dial through the frequencies, but he hadn't been able to get a station in hours. There was nothing but static. He leaned over to turn the radio off, and the truck rattled violently. The wheel jackhammered up his hands, and he applied a light touch to the brakes. The last thing he needed was to jackknife the trailer and end up off the road out here in the middle of nowhere. He always considered himself a pretty resourceful guy, but without water of any kind, things could turn bleak pretty fast. The brakes squealed as the rig came to a shuddering stop. The air brakes hissed as Mark's boots slapped pavement. Mark furrowed his brow. Behind the truck, less than a quarter mile up the highway, was a mass of rattlesnakes covering the highway. There were hundreds, maybe even thousands, in a writhing ball across the entire roadway. He had decimated a vast swath of them with the tires, and there was a trail of blood and guts spread out over a couple hundred feet that it took him to stop. The 2 reddish streaks ended at his rear tires. The survivors coiled and slithered across the lifeless corpse of their brethren. Mark took a few more steps to get a closer look, but not too close. He hated snakes, always had. The way they moved and their unfeeling eyes creeped him out. Not to mention the 2-inch fangs with poison strong enough to kill a man in minutes. To hell with that shit. He wasn't the bravest man, but he wasn't a pussy either. Mark took another tentative step towards the pile, and they seemed to sense his presence. An explosion of rattles rose in unison. Mark froze in place. He shuddered as a chill ran down his spine despite the heat of the day. He'd seen enough. He turned and walked back to his truck. When he reached the driver's side door, a hissing sound made his heart sink. For a moment, he thought it was the hiss of one of the rattlers, but he placed it quickly. His front driver's side tire slowly sunk onto the rim. Mark made a quick sweep under his truck to make sure there were none of the squirming little bastards waiting to bite him. He didn't see any. As he hunkered down to get a better look at the tire, he found the problem. There was a severed snake's head stuck in the rubber with its fangs buried to the hilt in the tire. He grabbed his crowbar, stuck the flat metal end underneath the snake's head, and flipped it off. The last bit of air from the tire rushed out. A wave of nausea rolled through him, and his vision blurred. He wasn't sure if it was from the early onset of heat stroke or the massive rattler slithering back down the road. It was probably a little of both if he was being honest. If he had just stuck to the interstate, he could be listening to reruns of Have Gun Will Travel with an ice-cold Coke and a bag of peanuts. But no, he had to take the shortcut, and now he was stuck in the middle of the goddamn desert with nothing to drink. At least he had enough diesel to keep the truck running for a while. Someone was bound to come along eventually, and everything would be fine, he told himself. Though he was surely going to lose the time he would have made up taking this bastard of a route and probably have to fork out $40 to get the tire fixed. His dad always told him the shortcuts of any kind led to problems, but he never listened to his old man. He always had to try to make a quick buck or try to cheat the system in one way or another, but it always ended the same way, with him getting his ass handed to him and realizing his old man was right, as much as he hated to give credit to the old bastard. Mark climbed back in the cab, laid his head against the headrest, and closed his eyes. There were 2 choices. One, he could slowly drive on the rim and try to make it to a service station. It would undoubtedly destroy the rim, and he'd have to spend the next week waiting for Peterbilt to ship the replacement to him. And the thought of spending a week stuck out in this hellhole made his stomach turn. If things got dire, maybe he would take that option. But for now, fuck that. Option 2 sounded a bit better, though it had its own problems. He could sit out here and hope someone eventually found him, but it was going to be a crapshoot because he hadn't seen another soul in hours. And he could feel the heat working at his body already. If he wasn't heat sick yet, he was on the verge. Of all the places in the world to run low on AC coolant, of course it had to be in one of the hottest places on Earth. A car door closing interrupted his thoughts. He peered over the dashboard at an ancient-looking man with a yellow straw cowboy hat and a long white beard walking up to his truck. An old record from the early 40s sat in the road in front of his rig. It looked like it was painted red once upon a time, but now there was more rust than paint. Mark rolled down the window. "Afternoon," said the old man. "Need a tow?" "Yeah, I'd really appreciate it." "All right, give me a minute and I'll have you hooked up." "Do you need any help?" "Nah, I'll be fine. You just sit tight." The old man turned to head back to his truck, and Mark leaned out the window. "Hey, watch out for the rattlesnakes back there. There's hundreds of them covering the road about a quarter mile back. That's what happened to my tire." "Don't you worry about me. I've lived here my whole life. There's more snakes in these parts than people, and I can handle myself." "All right," Mark chuckled. "Just making sure." The old man hooked him up, and the endless highway rolled by again. The sun had nestled below the horizon, and coral hues painted the sky. The heat from the day had lost some of its power, but it still felt like an oven in the cab. Ange was going to kill him if he didn't make it back for Jack's birthday. He promised he would be there this time. Driving for a living was hard, and sometimes things got in the way of him doing what he was supposed to do. But he had 3 weeks of sobriety under his belt, and it was the best he'd done in years. A set of lights came into view on the horizon. As they grew closer, a smile flitted across his face. A large clown statue stood on top of the building, holding an array of different colored balloons that rotated as it turned back and forth. The clown waved, and a creepy electronic laugh came from the speaker near the base of the building as they pulled into the service station. A large pink neon sign that read Dr. Waxman's Museum of Horror blinked and sputtered as the shade of night was pulled the rest of the way over the beige landscape. The old man parked the tow truck next to a large garage door, and Mark climbed out of the cab and stretched his arms behind him. It felt good to be out of that metal coffin, move his legs a bit, and get the blood flowing again. "Great place you have here," he said to the old man. "It used to be a lot better before they diverted the highway 50 miles south of here. In its heyday, this place was always packed. It was the only service station for 100 miles in either direction. Business was a booming, son. Then that son bitch Eisenhower and his goddamn Federal Highway Act." The old man shook his head. "Ever since then, we barely survive on the locals and the occasional looky-loos who wander out here to see the museum. You know Bela Lugosi? He used to frequent this establishment in the 30s. He used to stay the night at that old inn before it burnt down in the summer of 42. Wow. I love the aesthetic of the place. It's definitely got the right vibe. It feels like it'd fit right in maybe in a Hitchcock picture or something." Mark cocked his head and took in the strangeness of the place. "Maybe so. Come inside and have a seat. It's going to take me a bit to fix your tire. I don't move like I used to, if you know what I mean." The old man winked at him like there were other people around they were keeping a secret from. Mark followed the old man inside, and the strange interior struck him oddly. The walls had macabre knickknacks, covering almost the entirety of the space. There was a rattlesnake head mounted on a wooden plaque, a ragged children's doll with long black hair covering its face, and a large cast iron cauldron suspended from the ceiling with a strange green light spilling out of the opening. "Have a seat in one of the booths. Feel free to look around, but remember to keep your hands to yourself. We don't take too kindly to thieves around here." The old man flashed a toothless grin and stepped back into the night. An old window-mounted air conditioner rattled and shuddered like it was on its last legs. The unit's front grille was rusty, and the condensation had eaten most of the original white paint. There was an ancient-looking payphone with an old rotary dial thing hung on the wall, and Mark decided he should probably call Angie to let her know where he was. If the old man fixed the tire fast enough, maybe he would make it back home on time, with Ange none the wiser. Mark walked across the faded black and white checkered floor. The white tiles had seen better days as they leaned more towards yellow than white. He picked up the receiver and fished a dime out of his pocket. The phone rang a few times before Angie's familiar voice came on the other end of the line. "Guthrie residence." "Hey, Ange, it's just me." "Oh, hey, is everything okay?" "Yeah, I just wanted to check in. Are the kids asleep?" "I just put Jack to bed a half hour ago, and I was about to read Princess Tina to Mags for the 100th time." Ange chuckled. "Alright, well, don't have too much fun," he laughed. "Hey, I decided to take a shortcut and got a flat tire." He didn't mention the rattlesnakes. The last thing he wanted to do was make her worry for nothing. "I'm at a place called Dr. Waxman's Museum of Horror out on Route 190 in western Nevada. I'm getting my tire fixed, and I should be home by Friday night." "Are you okay? You sound a bit off." "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm probably just a little dehydrated. It's hot as hell out here, and the AC in the truck just ain't cutting it. I think it's run out of coolant is all." "Well, when you get back, you can take it over to Murray's and have him fill it." "Yeah, probably not a bad idea. Anyway, I'm gonna let you go. Give Maggie a kiss for me, and I'll call you in the morning." "Okay, hun. Be careful." "Will do. Love you." "Love you too. Bye." Angie hung up the phone. Mark hung the receiver back on the base, and the coin dropped into the basin with a metallic clatter. He walked around the museum with his hands behind his back, taking in the strange collection of oddities. A half hour later, the old man came back in, wiping the grease off his hands with an old blue chamois. It wasn't like his entire denim overalls weren't stained black from grease, but Mark was grateful either way. You're all patched up and ready to go. How much do I owe you? $20. Mark sighed and pulled his wallet out of his pocket. He picked out one of the 3 crisp 20s he kept in case of emergencies and handed it to the old man. Pleasure doing business with you. The old man pulled his keys out of his pocket and dropped them in Mark's hands. Thanks. How much for one of the Cokes? He pointed to the old faded ice chest cooler. On the house. Really? Thanks. You have a good night, sir. Mark reached into the cooler and pulled out an ice-cold Coke. The outside of the bottle was wet to the touch. He popped the cap off on the side of the machine and tossed it in the trash. Mark took a long, deep pull off the bottle, and the sweet carbonation burned as it went down. He let out a burp and held the bottle to the old man in salute. He turned and walked toward the door when the old man spoke. Before you go, you should probably be aware that the bridge over in Marinville washed out in the spring floods. You can't be serious. The thought of driving over the rattlesnake party again made his heart speed up a little. Is there any other way through the desert besides driving 5 hours back the way I came? You could take the old abandoned highway. No one really uses it these days, though, and the roads are not in the best of shape, but it'll get you back to civilization. Okay, how do I get there? You're on it. Just turn left on your way out. Where does it end up? The highway ends on the north side of Barstow. You should be able to get back on the interstate from there. Okay, thanks again. Have a good evening. Mark saluted the old man with the half-drank bottle of Coke and stepped out the door into the night. The bell above the door gave its little jingle. The Coke was wonderful, but a cold beer would have done it much better. He almost paused to turn back and ask the man if he had any stashed away, but he remembered Jack's smiling face and Ange's angry one. This time he was going to be there for them. He promised. The wind picked up and the smell of rain was heavy in the air. Thunder boomed from the direction he was heading. Mark glanced at the black thunderheads and walked over to his truck. A little rain wouldn't be so bad. It beat the awful heat he'd endured for most of the day. Plus, that sweet earthy smell was always his favorite. There was nothing like the smell after a fresh rain. Things were looking up. He'd resisted the urge to go back inside and ask the old man for a beer, and the night air was almost crisp on his skin. He took a deep breath and pulled out of the museum's parking lot. It felt good to be back on the road and put some distance between him and that creepy service station and this strange old man. The red-tailed hawk followed the shiny red beast as it left the cluster of buildings. He had eaten more meat in the last couple of hours than the entire summer. The bounty left behind by the shiny red beast in the middle of the highway was a heavenly smorgasbord. The red-tailed hawk ate until he couldn't, and then labored into flight, finding a nice perch overlooking the shiny red beast as it disappeared into a weird-looking cave. The red-tailed hawk snuck a quick nap, tucking his head underneath his feathers. He dreamed of fields of mice and rattlesnake guts. The sound of the red shiny beast's growl woke him. The lumbering thing continued its journey, and the red-tailed hawk followed. The approaching storm looked dangerous to fly through, so he climbed until he was above the churning darkness. A small gap in the clouds allowed him to see the storm front and shroud the tiny red beast. Flying above was pointless, so instead he veered off to the east with plans to return to his new god, or best friend? He wasn't quite sure which yet. The storm came on like a racing wall of darkness. It blotted out the stars and spread over the land like a crashing wave. The first few drops hit the windshield like a warning. Then the levee broke, and the wipers struggled to keep up with the torrential downpour. Mark eased his foot off the accelerator. Visibility was down to a few hundred feet in front of his truck, and he found himself leaning closer to the windshield to see. As he came around a sharp bend, a black shape appeared in the middle of the road. Mark slammed on his brakes to avoid hitting whatever it was. The tires squealed and the truck slid as the brakes locked. The truck careened toward the shadowy figure. There was nothing he could do to avoid it. Mark twisted his face in a grimace, squinting his eyes. Just before contact, the truck came to an abrupt stop. Mark rocked violently forward and back in his seat. His sunglasses clattered onto the center console, and his heart machine-gunned against his ribcage. That had been far too close for comfort. He took a few deep breaths, attempting to get his racing heart back in line, worried about what he would find outside. Mark searched the darkened cab and found the newspaper he bought yesterday sitting on the passenger seat. His boots splashed on the road. There was nothing there. Whatever it was, it hadn't been very big, maybe the size of a large dog or a young bull. Mark walked around the truck. The rain drummed against the earth, a deafening roar. He checked both shoulders of the road, and they were empty. There was no sign of the thing he'd hit, or almost hit. The truck was so big and he'd stopped so fast that if he did clip something, he wouldn't have felt it. Mark sighed and climbed back into his truck. The gears ground as he shifted in first and accelerated down the rain-shrouded road. A few minutes passed, and there was another black shadow, this time standing on the side of the road instead of in the middle. As he got closer, the human shape swam into focus. Who in the hell is out here in this weather? Shit! Mark slammed on the brakes again, and the truck shuddered violently to a stop next to the wet figure. He hopped out of his truck, his clothes soaked clean through before his boots hit the pavement. The rain came in driving sheets, and his dark brown hair stuck to his face in waving storms. An old woman with a soaking wet shawl and straggling gray hair looked up at him and smiled. "What the hell are you doing out here, ma'am?" "Oh, I decided to go for an evening walk, and I think I missed my turn. Would you be a dear and help an old lady get home?" "Sure, let me help you in the truck." "Thank you, dearie." Mark helped her into his truck and closed the door behind her. He climbed into his wet seat and ran his fingers through his hair to get the wet strands out of his eyes. "Do I need to turn around?" "No, there's a little road about a mile up ahead. I think, anyway." She half chuckled and half coughed. Mark shifted the truck into first gear and pulled back onto the road. The storm seemed to pick up in ferocity somehow, and he leaned up next to the windshield to make out the faded yellow lines on the highway. The hair on the back of his neck rose as he noticed the old woman looking at him from the corner of his eye. She had a creepy grin on her face that didn't sit right with him. The faster he could get her out of his truck and get back on the road, the better. "How much farther?" "You should be seeing the turnoff any minute now." The old woman's voice was high-pitched and reedy, like her vocal cords ran over a cheese grater. Mark wasn't a fan of her voice. Something wasn't right about her. He kept sneaking glances, but her eyes never left him. A small dirt road came into view a minute later, and she raised an arthritic finger at it, and he nodded. The road was severely rutted, and the truck rocked back and forth as he reeved down the winding road, trying to keep the truck inside the ill-defined edges. A sandstone cliff, at least 100 feet in the air, peered out of the darkness. The face was as flat as a sheet of paper. As he got closer, he noticed a large, dark wooden door set into the cliffside. The red-tailed hawk watched as the shiny red beast turned down the road toward the cliffs. A great sense of sorrow came over him as his new friend entered a place that even the animals didn't dare venture into. The hawk let out a sorrowful screech and soared back toward the black stretch of unnatural land. "That is my home there," the old woman said, raising her gnarled hand towards the door. Mark pulled the truck sideways, making sure not to put it in park. "All right, here you are, ma'am." He was trying to be polite as he could be. Something was off about the woman, and if he could avoid offending her and get her the hell out of his truck, the quicker the better. "Thank you," she mewed. "It would be rude of me not to invite you in for a cup of tea." Greed swam and shifted beneath her milky eyes. "Oh, no thank you. I appreciate it, but I'm on a tight schedule." "Are you sure you won't come in for just one cup?" "I'm sure. I really must be going." "I'm afraid you ain't going anywhere, dear." Mark turned in his seat toward her. A spike of fear settled in the pit of his stomach. The last of his patience with her and this whole fucking detour evaporated. "Get the hell out of my truck. I'm not going to ask you again." The old woman's shape moved in the darkness, shifting and contorting. Red light filled her eyes, and Mark's skin grew cold. Mark shifted into first gear and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The truck tires spun in the loose scree, but it didn't move. Lightning flashed over the rock outcropping, illuminating the scaly flesh and razor-sharp fangs. Mark screamed as he tried to press the accelerator through the truck's floor, but it was no use. The truck wouldn't move. The old woman crawled across the cab slowly. Mark grabbed at the door handle and tried to yank it open, but the familiar click of the latch didn't come. He must have bumped the damn lock with his elbow. In his panic, his fingers, like bloated hot dogs attached to his wrists, fumbled at the simple task. He couldn't get them to do what he wanted. Mark struggled with the lock as the thing posing as the old lady crossed the center console. The lock popped open as an icy claw latched onto his wrist. Mark bucked against the door with his body, trying to escape the wretched thing. Her hot, rancid breath ran across the back of his neck. He turned and sent a straight right, hitting the thing square in the eyes as hard as he could. His hand crumpled against the bony ridges on the monster's face. Shards of bone tore through flesh. Pain flashed up his arm, and he pulled his injured hand close against his chest. The thing threw back its head and cackled, a sound that made every hair on his body stand on end. Mark writhed against the vice-like grip as he was reeled in towards the mewling monstrosity straddling the center console of his truck. Her fangs entered the soft, meaty part of his neck, and a splash of coppery blood ran down his neck, plastering his shirt to his skin. The monster greedily slurped at his blood, draining the life from his body. He would never be there for Jack or Maggie again. Would they think he abandoned them? Would they not realize he loved them very much, despite not being at Maggie's plays or Jack's baseball games? If only he would have told his bosses no more often. Maybe he could have been there for them. I'm sorry, Ange. I'm sorry, kids. As the monster fed, Mark's vision faded to black. Angie brushed off the first day that Mark didn't show up. He'd been late many times before with a plethora of excuses. On the second day, worry flitted across her mind, but she recalled a couple of times that Mark broke down and couldn't find a phone to call her, or ended up in the bottom of a bottle. He'd better not be drinking again. She put up with a lot and loved him deeply, but the kids deserved better. If he was off the wagon again, then it would be the last straw. The third morning when she woke up, she knew something was wrong. After spending the day calling police stations, hospitals, and bars around the area, she came up empty. Ange called her mom to watch the kids, loaded up the station wagon, and started the 600-mile drive towards the last place she knew he was. Dr. Waxman's Horror Museum. Ange left before dawn, kissing both of her kids as they slept, and stepped out into the pre-dawn morning. She pulled into Dr. Waxman's parking lot as night settled over the desert. The bell above the door gave its little jingle as she stepped inside. An old man wearing a yellow straw cowboy hat and a long white beard smiled as she walked in. Howdy, stranger. Welcome to Dr. Waxman's Museum of Horror. What can I do you for? Hi, my name's Angie Guthrie. She stuck out her hand and he shook it. My husband Mark called me from here last week and he never came home. Do you remember him? She pulled out an old photo of Mark from a family vacation to Disneyland the year before and showed it to the man. Oh yeah, your husband had a flat tire, ran over a mess of rattlesnakes on the highway. I patched it up and he went on his way. Do you know which way he went when he left? Yes, ma'am. He said he'd go through Marinville, but I told him the abandoned highway would save him a few minutes, but I'm not sure if he took my advice or not. I was in the back when he left. He was mighty keen on getting back home to his wife, and I can understand why. The old man winked at her. You're too kind. Which way is the abandoned highway? You're on it. Just make a left when you leave. Okay, thanks for your help. Ange turned to walk out of the door when his voice stopped her. Oh, hey. My wife's a bit of an insomniac, and when she ain't sleeping so well, she likes to walk along the highway. Might be a chance she saw your husband. We don't get much traffic out here in the boonies, so a big rig would stand out. You could go ask her if you like. Is there any way you can call her for me and ask? I'm sorry, but we don't have a phone. I can draw you a map, though. Okay, I guess it couldn't hurt. Thanks. The old man handed her a map on a mustard-stained napkin, and she was happy to be out of there. Something wasn't quite right about the man or the place. The way he looked at her was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on the why. He just didn't sit right with her. But she would turn every stone and follow any lead to find Mark. She prayed it wasn't to drink again, but after 3 days there were only two options: booze or some sort of accident. Ange turned left and headed down the desolate two-lane highway. The full moon sat at the dome of the night sky ahead of her. The desert was lovely at night. During the day, it was a hot, miserable mess, but at night, with the stridulations of crickets and the cool breeze, it wasn't half bad. Ange turned down the dirt road that the man had marked on the map. A cliff face rose into view, and she fought the urge to turn around. Maybe I should find a motel and come back in the morning. That would be silly. The woman was likely to be more tolerable than her creepy husband, and she was already here. She might as well check this off her list and head on into the next town so she could search the bars and the hospitals. Ange parked the station wagon, and on her way up to the ancient-looking door set in the face of the cliff, she noticed a line of fresh wheel ruts near the front door. She took a deep breath and knocked. There was movement behind the door, a skittering sound that made her heart rise into her throat. Every hair on her body stood on end, and she turned and jogged back to her car. The old lady probably didn't know anything anyway. She was wasting time out here. The door creaked slowly open. An old woman peeked her head out and smiled when she saw her. "Can I help you, dear?" Ange froze in place. Her mind screamed for her to get the hell out of there, but her manners were stronger. She turned and smiled as warmly as she could. "Hi, ma'am. Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for my husband. He's a trucker and drives a big red Peterbilt semi. He never came home, and your husband said there's a chance you might have seen him. I'm trying to find which direction he went when he left the museum." "Come inside, dearie. I just put on a pot of tea and I'll tell you what I know." "I really shouldn't. I need to be going." Ange backed away from the door, struggling with the urge to run from the woman. "But I insist." The old woman advanced towards her. The shadowy outline of her body shifted in the darkness. Red light beamed from her vertically slit eyes. Several old ladies walked out behind her and formed a half circle. Their greedy, wrinkled faces melted in the moonlight, shifting like maggots writhing underneath their skin. "They look like a sewing circle from hell," Ange thought as she took a few backward steps from the advancing group of women. Ange turned and ran. A cold, snake-like hand coiled around her arms and legs from behind. She was pulled off of her feet and violently drawn back in through the door, landing hard on the stone flooring. All the air in her lungs escaped in a harsh barking wheeze. White lights danced in front of her eyes. The lady that answered the door flew across the stone floor in a blink of an eye and buried her fangs high on her inner thigh as the others joined in, tearing at her flesh like starving, ravenous beasts. Ange let out a gut-wrenching scream as a scaly tongue entered her eye cavity. Her eyeball exploded out of its socket. The warm, jelly-like substance landed on her cheek before being slurped greedily down by one of the creatures. The smell of rotting flesh and cloying spice filled her nose as the sickening sounds and all the painful feelings faded into nothingness. "At least I didn't bring the kids. I'm sorry for doubting you, Mark. I'm so sorry." Her last thoughts faded as she crossed to a place where they couldn't hurt her anymore. A loud chorus of maniacal laughter filled the desert inside the ancient stone caves as the summer breeze rustled the surrounding sagebrush. A lone coyote howl pierced the night in the distance as the moon lazily arced over the desolate desert highway. The red-tailed hawk flew over the cliff dwelling at a high enough altitude so as not to draw the gaze of the creatures that lived beneath. As he passed the crest of the mountain, the backside of the cliff opened up into a large box canyon connecting to the back of the creature's lair. There were huge piles of shiny beasts of varying shapes and sizes and colors. Some were wooden canvas, and others were shiny metal, like his poor friend. It was a stunning visage of the thousands who'd wandered into the creature's lair over the centuries. His friend, the shiny red beast, sat on top of the pile and reflected the full moon back to him. The red-tailed hawk let out a final pained screech that echoed off the canyon walls. He circled for a while in salute to his dead friend, before disappearing over the horizon and out into the desolate wasteland. As the days passed, with no word from her daughter or her son-in-law, the grandmother loaded the kids in the back of her car and headed to the last place her daughter said she was going to look for that worthless husband of hers, Dr. Waxman's museum.